Personally, I find the philosophical and historical arguments against mandatory masking to be compelling regardless of the actual effect masks have. But I'm going to start with some of the empirical evidence regarding face masks, because even proponents of mandatory face coverings concede that if they were not such an essential part of public health, then forcing people to cover their faces would be unconstitutional and immoral. Let's start by comparing the effectiveness of medical masks and cloth masks, and I'm going to explain in just a couple minutes why I started here. The best study on this topic is a randomized controlled trial that was conducted in Hanoi, Vietnam in 2015. The research team compared respiratory viral infection rates between two groups of healthcare workers, one of which wore disposable medical masks and one of which wore two-layer cotton cloth masks that were washed every day. The results were unequivocal. Healthcare workers who wore cloth masks, even cloth masks that were washed daily, had a substantially higher rate of respiratory viral infections, including from coronaviruses, than healthcare workers who used disposable medical masks. Now, this probably comes as no surprise that medical masks have a superior performance to cloth masks. So why open with this? Well, because this cloth face mask study by McIntyre et al. Was a best-case scenario for cloth mask use. It involved healthcare workers who had training and experience wearing their masks and washed them more than 9 out of 10 days. But more importantly, this clear difference in infection rates between medical masks and cloth masks has profound implications if we can get a solid comparison of respiratory viral infections between groups of people who wear medical masks and those who wear no masks at all. And it turns out that we do have such comparisons, even prior to 2020. The 2015 study was just one in a series of studies co-authored by many of the same researchers. 4 years earlier, in 2011, McIntyre and colleagues conducted a study in Beijing with over 1,900 healthcare workers comparing the protective effects of medical masks and N95 masks against respiratory infections. Comparing medical and N95 masks is a separate debate, but in this 2011 study, the group labeled control on Figure 2 was a convenience, non-randomized group of non-mask-wearing hospital personnel from other hospitals in Beijing. Because this convenience group was non-randomized and came from a different group of hospitals, the researchers were forced to conclude that it is not possible to make any definitive judgment on the efficacy of masks on this basis. However, the researchers could not help noting that the observed infection rate from all viruses, including influenza, was not significantly different between the non-mask cohort and the medical mask cohort, less than 0.5%. What's remarkable is that these results from the 2011 study are consistent with the results of the only randomized controlled trial that we have, which was specifically designed to compare rates of SARS-CoV-2 and other viral infections in groups of people wearing medical masks versus no masks at all. The Danish face mask study by Bundgaard et al., which was published in November of 2020. Out of more than 4,800 participants who completed the Danish face mask study, the general mask-wearing group had a 1.8% SARS-CoV-2 infection rate compared with the non-masked group's 2.1%, a difference of 0.3%, and the subgroup that wore the mask, quote, exactly as instructed, had an even less divergent 2% infection rate. A difference of 0.1% is not statistically significant. So to recap, the best evidence we have from randomized controlled trials shows no statistically significant difference in respiratory viral infection rates between medical masks and non-masks, and a much higher rate of respiratory viral infections in cloth mask wearers. What we have here is a strong line of evidence that cloth face coverings are actually worse than nothing, and the discussion in McIntyre's 2015 article actually highlights this, as well as acknowledging that the earlier 2011 and 2013 studies in their series did not show an antiviral efficacy for medical masks. Quote, we found no significant difference in rates of virus infection in medical mask users between the 3 trials, suggesting that the results of this study could be interpreted as partly being explained by a detrimental effect of cloth masks. This is further supported by the fact that the rate of virus isolation in the no-mask control group in the first Chinese randomized controlled trial was 3.1%, which was not significantly different to the rates of virus isolation in the medical mask arms in any of the 3 trials, including this one. One of the conclusions of the 2015 McIntyre study was that, quote, cloth masks should not be recommended for healthcare workers, particularly in high-risk situations. So, if cloth masks are not recommended for healthcare workers in high-risk situations, why are they being forced on the general public in an ostensibly high-risk situation? Now, take this information and combine it with other pertinent bits of information that we have from other studies, but which never seem to get reported on, such as Chin et al.'s 2020 finding that SARS-CoV-2 remains stable longer on the inner and outer lining of medical masks than on most other surfaces. Dr. Robert Redfield, the director of the CDC, is on record as holding up a medical mask and saying,
I might even go so far as to say that this face mask is more guaranteed to protect me against COVID than when I take a COVID vaccine.
Okay then, let's take a look at some of the things that affect face mask efficacy according to studies that the CDC cites, such as this one by Konda et al. Let me state this as directly as possible. According to studies cited by the CDC, gaps dramatically decrease the filtration efficiency of all face coverings. Beards create such gaps. So, to Dr. Redfield and everyone else with a beard, if you truly believed that COVID-19 was dangerous and that face masks have protective value, and you're going to reference laboratory studies such as Konda's as evidence in favor of face masks, you should have shaved your beard off back in March of 2020. Even the CDC's own community guidelines for what turns an encounter into an exposure tacitly acknowledge doubt in the efficacy of face masks because they say that a community encounter at less than 6 feet for more than 15 minutes with a known case of COVID becomes an exposure regardless of whether or not anyone involved was wearing a mask. But that's not all. Multiple studies currently being cited as supporting evidence for the protective effects of face masks actually provide evidence in the opposite direction when closely examined. Let me just go over the two that I've personally investigated the most closely.